What is going on? Why is the video black and white? Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna leave it like that. I don't feel like changing it. Um, if it looks black and white on y'all screen, let me know. But it looks black and white on mine. I don't know what's going on with this. So, uh, for those that didn't know, I didn't get a chance to go live last week. Uh, the weeks before, the power supply to the computer failed. So, of course, with no power supply, computer's not going to come on. So, I'm going live this week. So, if you're new or you to the channel, whatever, you got to hit the notification so that way you'll know when I go live. I don't get a chance to go live as much as um, I don't get a chance to go live as much as I want to anymore because I got a lot of things occupying my time for now. But uh, yeah, this is weird. For those that are tuning in, and of course, people will start, you know, maybe more people can tune in. But like I said, I'm looking on my screen and it looks black and white, which is weird. Yeah, I don't know. I was looking at it too. I'm looking at my screen like I don't know what's going on with the video, why it looks black and white. But I'm like, I'm already live, so I'll fix it next time. But this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. There's little technical stuff that gives you issues. So I don't know what's going on. I have no idea why it's black and white. Then again, I've been using this webcam for years. It's probably time for me to upgrade my camera system anyway. I think a lot of people use a DSLR and they run a software and all that as their camera set up and different lighting. That's how they get the look that they're getting. I'm gonna have to do that because I got 14 DSLR cameras, and so there's no reason why I shouldn't be using one of those cameras anyway instead of this webcam. So I guess I'll incorporate that for next live stream, better video. But I said it's black and white. At least you can see me. So that's that's all about. So what I want to talk about is the last time I was doing the live stream, I was going to talk about the music industry. And yeah, he said 14 cameras. Yeah, welcome. Like I said, those are the tuning in. Welcome. Yeah, but they're not. It ain't like they're. These are DSLRs that anyone can buy because they're like older DSLRs. You know, like the Nikon D3X. Stuff like that, or the Canon. They're like the Canon. I got the 1DX Mark II, stuff like that. They're not like brand new $7,000 cameras. These are cameras you can buy probably because they're about 8, 9, 10 years old, $300-$400. Yeah, they're very affordable. Like I got the original Mark D Classic. But they still I count them because I own them. So, but moving on, I wanted to talk about the music industry for a little bit because most people, if you think about it, a lot of people get into this because they want to have a music career. Some people want to do it as a hobby, but a lot of people, they want to get their own recording studio, maybe whatever. We got to the point now where we don't need record labels anymore. Um, yeah, things like that. We don't need a record label, or you just don't need to sign a record contract to get onto a record label to get you on the radio and maybe a music video and things like that anymore. You just don't need it. Because the internet is so more accessible for people. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who believe that it's hurting the industry because a lot of people can't make the money. But, recording artists never made a lot of money any old way anyway. How most recording artists they were always on the road touring, right? So, but record labels at that time, they had the marketing strategy that an independent or non-person that didn't have a contract didn't have the edge. Like, if you're on a label, it was easy for a record label, like distribution, because that's when record stores existed and stuff like that. How y'all doing? Like I said, we're hard, as I tune in, welcome, Joseph. Um, um, we're going to talk about the music industry for a little bit and more recording stuff, but I'm talking about the industry. So even if people were able to get signed to a record label, and they were able to sign. Now those are the tuning in. Like I said, my this is weird. I gotta figure out why it's in black and white, and it's probably a setting. The power supply went down on my computer that I normally do my live streams from, so I got a new power supply. But now it won't recognize my HDMI, so now my other screen here is out because it sees it, but I don't know if it's this. It could be this. I'm gonna try a different monitor, but also now my CD-ROM player won't eject again. It's weird. This PC does some weird stuff. So yeah, it's time for me to go get another Mac. I got a Mac. I got a Mac right here, but it's time for me to go get another. Maybe I ought to go get a Mac, bro. But anyhow, I'm laughing, but because I'm really technically a PC guy. But anyhow, so I'm talking about the industry. So, but even if everyone knows about the old system, an artist, whether it's a group, an individual artist, or a band or whatever, they would get a record deal. Then they would get an advance, money up front, but they had to pay that back because it's basically loaning some money up front to get you going. Then once you get going, you got to pay that back, right? The record label's going to recoup that, right? Somebody, we said computers don't make mistakes. Whatever they do don't. It probably is. It probably is trying to sabotage my. Who knows? Maybe I'm putting out too much information. Who knows? Maybe it's some sort of cyber attack. Anyhow, so to make a long story short, so you would get a record deal, get an advance, then they would use some of that money to live on. Plus, they needed to pay for the. You had to pay for the studio time and things like that. But they didn't make a lot of money. The record labels fixed it in the contracts where they were going to get recoup majority of all revenue through especially mechanical royalties like CDs, cassettes, vinyls. So the recording artists had to. I'm trying to block the fan so it doesn't hit the mic. So the recording artists had to basically tour to make their money. So the more tour they can tour, like if they can get 100 tour dates, the average ticket range between $25 to $100 per person, depends on the seating. And they can fill out maybe 5,000 people, whatever, typical 5,000 to 10,000 concert, because their popularity is high, like maybe Beyonce or something. Yeah, they can, you do 100 tour dates, you can make a few $1 million doing that. But not every artist can do that. Some artists are still touring off of yesterday's hits. So you would have to be someone like Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder's got about 40 number one hits, right? Ranging from My Sherry Amore to, For Once in My Life to Isn't She Lovely to Part-Time Lover. Y'all know, y'all know, everyone knows quite a few songs from Stevie Wonder. So Stevie Wonder can still tour, even though he hadn't made any songs. Stevie hadn't had a number one hit, like a new latest hit since the 90s. But because he had 40-something hits, and we're talking classics, Ribbon in the Sky. Y'all I'm talking about, just tons of them, right? So that's why he can still tour. But if you have an artist like Freddie Jackson, who's only had a couple of albums of maybe, Freddie Jackson probably maybe had about 10 hits, right? Between his career. And most of those were 80s, right? He's got a small, that's why Freddie Jackson, even though he tours, he will not pull 10,000 seat concerts like Stevie. He just wouldn't. Someone put in Michael Jackson. Someone said Never in Your Sun is my. Okay, I don't remember that one, but I'm sure But someone put Michael Jackson. Yeah, Michael Jackson. Of course, he's another example of Quincy Jones did an outstanding job of getting Michael some hits, because that's what Quincy does as a Grammy award winning producer. They produce hits for these artists, but so but you think about Michael Jackson compared to his other brother, Jermaine. Jermaine only had a couple of hits, even though Jermaine probably has a library of probably as big as Michael's, but he just Jermaine just because Michael was just the highlight of the Jacksons, and second in line would be Janet. Janet was smart to get with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis on for Janet. But the music industry overall, for most people, if you can get through all those barriers, it's usually a short-lived career for 90% of most artists, most recording artists, single, a group, or even a band. It can be a short-lived career. If you think about it, I was sitting there thinking about, okay, even just a millionaire, you're not even an artist, just millionaires, right? I don't know if anyone ever does this, but if you watch, $1 million mansions, like a $1 million mansion for sale, if you want to know about the housing market, mansions are always for sale over the traditional, like a home like mine. This is typical. This is technically a 3-bedroom with a bonus, right? 2 bath, 2 car, typical 2-story home, right? So the average family can afford this type of house, but most people can't afford to live in a mansion because of the cost. $5 million mansion, but you're looking at about $15,000 in cost every month that a lot of people are not aware of. If you're dishing out that kind of money every month, if your revenue isn't coming in to support that, you gotta get out of that mansion, because the property tax, the cost of the utilities, the lights, water, gas. And so a lot of times when you become a rich celebrity, if you become a one-time hit, or it's like a lottery winner, you hit the lottery for $20 million, but then after taxes, you're only going to get about $11 million after they tax it, right? And then after $11 million, you go buy a $2 million mansion, you got $9 million. Well, you still got to maintain, $300,000 to $400,000 a year maintaining that mansion. If you ain't generating income, you'll go through that money like that, and that's just to maintain the house. That's not including the cars and everything else, and trips and vacations. Before you know, you can blow through millions. And this is why they say 75% of most lottery winners go broke because of that. So you think about that. If a lottery winner can go broke, so can a person in the music industry. If you're not generating money, making, doing tours, generating hits, keeping your career alive, you have to be doing what, be smart about it. You have to keep yourself relevant in the business, like Mary J. Blige has, or Mariah Carey has, Justin Timberlake. You have to be smart, or your career will be short-lived. And this is the reason why a lot of artists, I don't care if you're a hip-hop rapper, a singer, a band, because people don't understand the cost. It costs a lot of money to live rich. It does. It costs a lot of money. So welcome, DL. Said, you said the black and white filter kind of, well, it's not by design. I don't know why it's in black and white. So for those that are tuning in, I don't know. It's weird. I got to check it. I bet you it's a setting. I got to go back and check. So, but it is a different look. It is different, kind of like a nostalgic, like I'm back in like in the 50s, when TVs were black and white. So I said, it's cool. It's black and white. At least you can see the video. Oh yeah, Maddie says that the sheer promo budgets are extremely hard to maintain. Who has millions to throw? It's just a rich lifestyle, even if you're not an artist, right? It's a live stream from the 1950s. Yeah, it's cool. But anyhow, I never even thought about the perspective of that, because I was sitting there watching these $1 million homes. I was watching a thing called real life properties. In other words, they're the real, tours. And these are $1 million homes in Atlanta. And I was sitting there looking at these, this house is 2 million, 3 million for whatever, there's 6 bedroom, 7 bedroom, 8 bedroom, 9 bedrooms, so many bathrooms, the basements are, they got the wine room and they got the media room and they have a pool and just these big gigantic 2-story lot, and 4 and 5 car and 6 car garages and just stuff like that, right? That's just the house. And then I watched the thing and said, what does it cost to maintain $1 million home? And the cost of, for example, the pool has got to maintain a pool every month. That's $1,500, whatever. The utility could be $3,000, a month, depending on the square footage. If it's 15,000 square foot home, that many bedrooms or whatever, the utilities, water. Then you got to, the clean, have a cleaning crew. That's whatever that costs a month, and so forth. I was like, and that after I got done, the average $1 million home is about $15,000 to $20,000 a month. They're dishing out because people that can buy a $1 million home don't have mortgages; they just buy them right out. But they're still dishing out, 15 grand a month. And when you do that, 15 grand, that's a month. Well, I say, yeah, on the low end, 15 grand on the low end. But realistically, maybe $300,000 a year and just cost, because you got security and everything else, right? $300,000 a year in that house. And you're doing that, you think about that over the next 5 years in that home, you've dished out $1.5 million just to live in it. So it's crazy. And that's just to live in the house. That's not including the cars and everything else, so you're talking a lifestyle. I'm like, man, you have to really be rich to live rich. So, and if you can't maintain that, it can be short-lived. And that's why a lot of these, you could take, let's say, I'll use one, I'll make up a rapper name. Let's say you're, because most of us aren't taught about money, like how money actually works, right? Most of us, yeah, we know, get a job, get income, pay your bills, buy a house, buy a car, pay your, get a shirt. We know the typical stuff, but I'm talking about what the millionaires know. So I was thinking about that, because this also relates to a music career, right? You can get a number one hit, and all of a sudden, now you can start touring and everything else and start making money. But if it can become short-lived, that lifestyle's only for about good 4 or 5 years, and all of a sudden you faded out back into non-existence. People have forgot about you, and this happens to a lot of artists, right? So, so some artists are still trying to use their fame to cover their calls, right? That's, it's kind of like, I look at Adina Howard as an example. Adina Howard was extremely popular in 1994 or 92, 93 when she made that Freak Like Me song, right? But her career was short-lived. You hadn't really heard anything for Adina Howard after she fell out with her record label and her managers and all that. Disputes and disagreements killed her career. So the only time we have about Adina Howard is just memories. You go back on YouTube and watch Freak Like Me video. You watch a video like that and you say, yeah, okay, that's the only thing that's going to keep her alive as far as fame-wise, right? Other than that, Adina Howard hasn't been current in 30-something years, right? And that's the music industry, so it's kind of like, you think about the rappers from the 80s compared to the rappers today. You and I know Big Daddy Kane and, if I'm trying to think of some 80s rappers. Some of these rappers end up going and doing other things, like they can get into the movies, whatever. They try to alter their career, to keep themselves. It's kind of like Ice Cube realized he's making more money doing movies than it was if he was doing solo rap albums. Ice Cube could probably make maybe $1 million to, doing hip hop stuff, but Ice Cube would start making You know, when he started doing Fridays and started doing movies and got into Anaconda and those type of movies and a lot of other movies. Just same thing with Martin Lawrence. You know, same thing with comedians. Those comedians realize they can do more, they can make more money getting into the movies than doing stand up. You know, um, it's kind of like with Cat Williams. That was the bulk of Cat Williams' income was being appearing in movies. You know, Cat Williams is not making that kind of money doing stand up. Um, so it can be a short lived career. Um, Things can happen. You know, if someone dies, you know, a tragic event, if you're in a group or whatever, your manager dies or whatever. So it's kind of like I can invest, you know, $1 million into $1 million, you know, get a big old giant SSL studio, 24 track tape machine, and all this gear. And then all of a sudden, what I'm going to do with all that gear if I'm not doing my, you know, a lot of times I'm just going to open up a recording studio and just start becoming a producer and a recording engineer and start recording for other artists. That's what a lot of bands and artists end up doing when their career. Um, some of them still try to record their own stuff, but that's what happens to a lot of artists when they're not relevant anymore, and they, you know, whatever. And that's the ones that may want to open up a recording studio or whatever. So I just want to talk about the music industry a little bit. Plus, also the music industry. Everyone knows about what's going on with what happened with R. Kelly, and everyone knows what happened, you know, with the whole scandal with Bill Cosby, and everyone knows about this, you know, what's going on with P. Diddy. All that stuff is nothing. Believe it or not, that is not new. Believe it or not, that is common. The music industry, the entertainment industry, you know, the movie industry, the TV. It's some crazy stuff behind the scenes. Believe it or not, very crazy. So, back to us. I know quite a few rich guys who want to be famous. Yeah, you can. You know, the only thing about being a rich, deal said, yep, can you afford fame? And it depends because you can be famous and not be rich. You know, famous means you just, you know, you can be really, really popular for something. Like, for example, I'll use Lee Harvey Oswald. He's famous. He just ain't rich. You can be famous, but yeah, yeah. But the thing is, if you're rich and to be famous, it's a little bit easier to do because there's always someone um, that trying to get into your wallet when you're rich, and it's easier to make connections, believe it or not, than it is being poor. Poor, we just it's more when you're, you know, you just it's basically more like who can I can network with. But when you're rich, it's a little bit easier because money talks. I don't care. Money don't have a face. Money talks. But anyhow, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. You know, get y'all's perspective on the music industry, and you know, it's nice. You know, especially when you see this is not uncommon either. You can see recording artists, you know, you can look on a wall, and they can have gold and platinum albums on the wall. They can have Grammy sitting and American Music Awards, maybe MTV Awards, Image Awards, and all that on the shelf. And they can have their name written up in, you know, maybe some sort of um, discography or some sort of biography, you know, of artists and producers and all that. Like some people using that, you know, I'm the, you know, world renowned famous producer, Grammy award winning producer. You can use all them accolades and still be broke because winning a Grammy, there's no checks that come with a Grammy, right? Um, there really isn't. Um, so is that my neighbor? I think it is. My neighbor, he's got these two 18s, and he's got to make sure everyone knows that he's got two 18s. Y'all ever have neighbors like that? They got a sound system in their car, and they want everyone to know that they got a sound system. You know, I got a neighbor that's got to have attention. So I hear nothing but bass. Yeah, he's driving away because it went away. He drives purposely to see who's looking at him. Ain't nobody paying no attention. But anyhow, somebody said, Max, you see, if money attracts the industry, people, yeah. Oh yeah, Laura Cannon, yeah. That's just an example of super dark industry. It's because behind you think about it, uh, with the music industry or with money, what's to keep you from buying drugs? You can buy drugs. You can buy, with money, you can buy anything on the dark side. You can buy weapons. You can buy sex. You can buy anything when you got money. When you got the money, you can buy it, right? So all that stuff's gonna be accessible. If I want to go, and let's say I want to go get me a Ferrari, let me just rent me a Ferrari for a day. Let's say it costs $30,000 to rent. Well, if you got millions of dollars, you can rent a Ferrari like that. But that's where all that dark side, people, underground parties and all that, and people get hooked up on that. But anyhow, that's what I want to talk about a little bit on the music industry. And believe it or not, the recording industry is connected to that somewhat, because guess where all artists go, right? We all know where they go. They go to some recording studio to record, right? And so that's where you have these recording studios and engineers that start recording. That's how they meet all these artists. And a lot of times they can see number one hits being produced because they're witness it, because they're engineering it or whatever the case. They're recording it, right? So a lot of times these recording studios can actually be connected to, to managers and artists and everything else, especially if you have an artist that, let's say you have an artist, especially a big, well-known recording studio like the Record Plant. Well, they're pretty much half the industry is probably recorded at the Record Plant, right? So, yeah, these artists are going to go, name everyone from the Rolling Stones to Mariah Carey probably went to the Record Plant to record a couple of tracks at one point. So you definitely can meet artists. So I just want to get everyone's thoughts on the music industry. Is it worth it? Some people say, yeah, because, you can be well connected network wise. And I would say on that side, yeah, definitely. Uncle Pix, welcome, salutes and hello to our happy fathers out. Yeah, it is Father's Day, isn't it? So for those that are fathers, happy Father's Day. Because, everyone, when it comes to Mother's Day and all that, they spoil the mothers more than they do the fathers, but it is what it is. I just saw something earlier in the chat earlier. Joseph said PC for life. I was talking about getting a Mac earlier because my PC crashed. The power supply that powers this PC, it died. So I got another one. It took about a week or so to come in. So that's why I didn't live stream last week. And for some odd reason, now I got a new power supply, but I don't know. Some weird, crazy stuff was going on with this. I don't know. I got to figure it out. Oh yes, Maddie says a half a percent successfully make a living from music. It's believe it or not, it's an eye-opening experience. Y'all probably seen the video where the guy he runs up on 50 Cent and he's mad at the world because he can't. Now he wants to get because 50 Cent is supposed to automatically. This guy says I'm a rapper, or I got I can whatever, and I'm you're supposed to like me. 50 Cent don't know who that dude is. He gonna get mad and almost want to fight because 50 Cent won't pay him no attention. You got a lot of people there. There's a lot of ignorant people out there that just they think they have an inkling amount of talent, and all of a sudden everyone's supposed to recognize them. I don't know how people get like that. I'm like, but there are people that actually believe that. There's I don't know if it's an entitlement mentality or whatever the deal is, but I don't know why. It's a spoiled mentality. It's like like if I had kids, my That's why my 2-year would not have Jordans. Why would I buy my kid 2-year Jordans when they're going to grow out of them in 3 months? A 2 year is not going to be able to fit those same Jordans in 2 months, in 3 months. Their feet going to grow. That's why I would never buy. In the 70s, they used to call them knee knockers. That was those old white baby shoe with the hard bottoms. Yeah, you're only going to be in them for 2 months. That's just something to cover your feet. Now, when you start getting about, when do we stop growing? When we're about 18. That's the time to start buying Jordans, when you're 18. But some people may not agree with my outlook. I don't know. I don't see why I would want to keep buying shoes or anything like that when you kids, because I'm the same way. I was, we all were kids at one point. Why would I want to keep having expensive stuff? But when we're young, teenagers, we don't understand that. Because when you're a teenager, you don't understand the cost of things and life and but when you become an adult, then you start and you're on your own and you have to actually, be an adult, then you start understanding. Especially when you start getting older like me, in your 50s and all that, you have a whole different perspective of life and money management. So, anyhow, Oak said, music is music. The industry is what you make of it. It's an awesome place to be involved with great and sadly screwed up. Yeah, I think if you go into the music industry for the right reason, then yes, it can be somewhat. Because a lot of times, if you go in there and I say, I just want to make music that people are going to enjoy, that's all I want to do, then I think you would have a pleasurable experience. But if you go in there and like, I want to be the next, big star, and I want to make millions of dollars, and I want all this red carpet treatment, and I want to, this, and I want to have big yachts, and because you got a lot of people like that, because it can make it seem like people live like that. People live in the Michael Jackson life. They see these big time celebrities, Beyonce, they see Madonna, these people that have 200, 300, 400 millions of, million dollars or whatever. And they live in these $1 million mansions or whatever in these secluded neighborhoods and all that. And they're driving these, people are going to they think, oh, they live like that with the millions. I should be able to live like that. When in actuality, some of that's a facade. The music industry is, ugh. But if you go in there and like, I just want to make music, I think the rewards is that, I think in my experience, in my take on it, the rewards is if you go in there with a good heart and intentions of just making good music, I think you'll grow a crowd that will like you. And the benefits of that, people come, let's say you're an artist, then people will want to come see your shows, and you'll grow your audience, and you'll grow a loyal audience. And the benefits financially will somewhat reap that. But you got a lot of people that get in there for the wrong reasons. So let's see, Joseph, you just wrote something about, in my studio, Behringer, your desk MX8000, I got a Mac Pro connect to it. Yeah, I have the same console downstairs. I got a Behringer your desk downstairs, and it's what I use downstairs, so works perfectly fine. Now I don't have a Mac to it. I still have a PC connected to it, and of course upstairs I got Allen Heath here. Upstairs I have my when you get old, when you start forgetting stuff, right? I have my I forgot the name. Let me. That goes to show you that. My Orion, my Antelope. Oh man, I'm getting old, y'all. I'm getting old when I can't forget my freaking interface. My interface is an Orion Gen 3 up here, and downstairs I have my not the 896. I have the Motus, the Motu 24A. AO downstairs. So I have the Marketing Unicorn interface downstairs connected to my Eurodesk. Man, I'm getting old. I'm starting to forget stuff. Getting old, man, getting old. That's why when you're 50, you start forgetting little tiny things. So now I want to talk about recording. So we talked about the music industry for just a little bit. Let's talk about recording. Now, recording, believe it or not, is a subjective thing because there's so many ways to do it, right? When you're recording your music, but I still think no matter what style of music that you're playing, if you do these general things in your recordings, your music, you will still get good sounding recordings. And the process is on the front end is the recording itself, whatever you're going to record. Then there's the mixing aspect, and that's basically how you're going to mix it, what delays you're going to use, what reverbs you're going to use, how you're going to pan, how you're going to bring the vocals. Are you going to stack vocals? Are you going to use ping pong delays on vocals? Are you going to use this on vocals? Just the mixing, right? When am I going to, bring volumes up and down using some automation, things like that, right? What I'm going to put on bus channels, what effects I'm putting on auxiliary channels. That's the common stuff, right? And then for master bus, which is the main output, right? In the mixer, right? The main output, that's your master bus, the master output channels, right? The bus. Everything's going through that on the output. So what I'm going to put on that? Am I going to, that's the decision time. And a lot of engineers, this is one of the things that isn't discussed, but a lot of times it works no matter what pieces of gear, whether you're using real analog gear or you're going to stay in the box and maybe use plugins. The thing is, the one thing I would tell anyone when it comes to recording is make sure you understand signal flow, how the signal flows, because your DAWs are, believe it or not, are programmed to work like an in-the-box recording studio, especially for its mixer. On a real analog mixer, they will have the channels, because all channels are inputs, they're not outputs. So you're mixing the inputs on the channels, right? And then the output, which is the master output bus, is the output. And then you can determine and run everything to just the master output, or you can use those channels and subgroup them into buses, right? I'm going to have all my drums into a drum bus. I'm going to put all my instruments into an instrument bus. I'm going to put all my vocals into a vocal bus, and so forth. And some mixers have 8 buses only. Some mixers allow you to turn some channels into 16 buses or even 32 buses, like the big consoles. And on those big consoles, they allow you to turn the inserts on and off. Like on this Allen Heath, if you plug something in the channel, the insert is always on. So if I plug a compressor on channel 1 on an insert, the compressor is always going to be on unless I bypass that compressor at the rack. If I bypass it, then but the signal's still going through the compressor. It's just in bypass mode. But on a SSL or Neve console like that, you can actually insert something in on that channel, and you can turn that insert on and off. So but it's the same thing with how you would do it when you put a plug-in on a channel in your DAW. It works the same way. You just got to understand that. That's why I've been stressing since I've been doing this channel. If you're going to work in the box, at least know how to set up your mixer like an analog mixer. Understand how analog signal flow works in an analog mixer. And the mixer, the way it's designed in the program, will actually make it start to sound like it's working like an actual console. And you will hear the difference out your interface, because a lot of times people, when we're plugging the speakers, some people are working from their DAW's mixer, and they'll work through the mixer, and they'll come out maybe the speakers are plugged directly to the output of the interface, and then whatever the case. So a lot of times, if I say, okay, I'm going to create bus channels, but then I also create some auxiliary channels. I'm going to put all my effects and delays on auxiliary channels, and then I'm going to run what I'm going to run on my bus channel. I'm going to maybe a certain type of EQ and compressor and all that on the master bus. Well, you will hear that in your speakers through your interface. It will sound like that. That's why there's a lot of videos on, can you hear the difference between an analog and an in the box? Well, you can if you don't know what you're doing in the box. It's a lot, because there's some people that will just simply try to do everything, and they'll try to mix. And they won't even be in the mixer. They're trying to mixing through the tracking window. And that's where you see all the lines when you're, across, all the lines that you see on each channel. You see all the the lines of the audio and stuff that you're recording. People will start mixing on that channel. That's not where you're supposed to be mixing. That's the track window. That's like if you're working on a 24 or 48, whatever. You don't mix on your tape machine. You mix in the mixer. So that's where you should be doing that. So welcome, man. I hadn't been out. Like I said, a few things. Like last week, computer went down. I had to order another power supply, and like I've been saying, for everyone that are tuning in, it looks black and white, and I don't know why it looks black and white. I got to go back, and it's probably a setting, and probably change the settings. Sometimes these updates make changes to your computer, and you don't know they made changes. So, but I was talking about the music industry earlier, but I'm talking about recording now. So, so here's another question. If for those that don't know, maybe you do, maybe you don't. So how are these recording studios getting these big? How are they? Let's say I don't care what recording studio. It could be a famous recording studio, like East West in Los Angeles, or let's say it's Electric Lady in New York, or it could be the Hit Factory in Florida, whatever. Because all these recording studios are pretty much ubiquitously meaning the same concept to the recording approach. How is it that they're getting these top-notch recordings, and maybe people at home that are trying to do this are not? Well, and let's say you're going to record a band. You got enough room to record some drums, a bass. I'm using the typical stuff, right? So let's look at it like this. What do they do, right? Well, believe it or not, other than most of them we're going to have a control room. They're going to have a control room in a live room where the band's going to record, right? So this is what the typical recording studio is going to have. And the only really difference between some recording studios that have just a single control room and a live room. And these live rooms might have smaller rooms, like a drum booth room, maybe a vocal room. And other than that, and then sometimes they record in the live room, but they might have gobos, which are dividers, right? Then they might separate the sound. Sometimes they'll put the guitar amps in a separate room and mic it. It just depends on what the recording engineer is trying to do, right? So you got to ask yourself, because you think about it, when you have a band, these bands, sometimes the bands are recording everything at the same time. Sometimes they'll have bands where they might record some of the parts and then they're coming back and lay down other parts. Sometimes they'll come back and do overdubs. It just depends on what they're trying to do, right? But anyhow, so what are they doing? Well, here's some key factors. How the room sounds is what you're going to hear. That's key, right? So, and I'm talking about for live band. I'm not talking about for direct input, like for VST instruments, or like direct input sound instruments, like keyboards plugged directly to your interface. It's totally different. Anyhow, so this is the reason why when we're talking about microphones placed, you got to think of a microphone like its perception to its source. So, for example, if I'm going to record an instrument, a guitar, trumpet, sax, or whatever, like right now, I'm probably about maybe almost a foot away from this microphone I'm using. But if I get closer to the microphone, y'all hear the difference in the proximity, right? It sounds a little deeper, a little warmer. But as I get farther away, it sounds a little thinner. That can also, because of that, you think about it, as I get closer to the mic, it sounds a little bit lower and deeper. Well, if I have a thinner sounding sound, I might want to record the mic a little closer. But as if I have something that's already have enough low end, I might want to pull the microphone away from the source a little bit, right? This is what an engineer is thinking about. He's listening to a source and, okay, where can I place this mic without actually pulling too far away and starts to sound real thin as I get, and so forth. And then the second source, once you think about, okay, now the engineer's thinking about the choice of microphone. What's going to sound good? Is a dynamic microphone going to sound good? Is a ribbon microphone going to sound good? Is a condenser microphone? Is a condenser mic with options? Like, does it have a figure 8? Or does it have a cardio pattern? So forth. And do I want a cardio pattern because I just only want to record from the side and to the front, not anything behind it? Or do I want a figure 8 where I'm going to record the four source at the front, but I also want to hear lunar reflections in the back? Do I want to set to a figure 8? And so forth, right? So he's thinking about that too. So he's trying to, do I have a microphone that even does that? And on top of that, should I use a FET microphone, which stands for field effect transistor microphone, or do I want to use a tube microphone, or so forth? Do I want to use a, like for example, Newman U87 is a basically a solid state microphone. It doesn't have any tubes in it. But do I want to use a 47, which does have a tube in it? A lot of times when you have microphone with tubes, they have their own power supply boxes, right? And a lot of times you can change the pattern on the box, the power supply box, right? Sometimes you might, on the microphone, have some choices like, do I want to set the pad setting to reflect low end, anything below 20 hertz, or we have a frequency cutoff, 80 hertz below or whatever, right? So this engineer is thinking about all these things. The next thing after the microphone, let's think about what's going to be a good sounding preamp, because a preamp is going to amplify the quality of the microphone, right? A good quality preamp will basically amplify a good quality, make the sound. That's really the two key sources at the recording stage, right? So they're thinking about that and how it's going to sound in the room, especially when it comes to drums, out of everything, right? So they're thinking about this. And then after that, they're saying, well, do I want to use the preamp on the console, or do I want to use an external preamp, like a Neve 1073 preamp? Or do I want to use a, maybe a, I don't know, let's go with the two most popular ones would be the Neve or the API, right? An API 312 or something like that. Of course, the most popular one is the 73, but a lot of people, I would think about the 1073, but Neve also had a 1081 and 1084. Neve had more than just one preamp. And where these preamps came from, like 1073s, 1081, they came out of consoles. Engineers got smart because that's what was the main thing, was everything was going through a console. And then it's like, well, I don't want to use the Neve I don't want to use the Neve EQs, but I do want to use the Neve preamp. So these engineers got smart and said, well, we'll take a channel out and build just the preamp section and make it into a rack unit by itself. That's where a lot of this stuff started happening. We're talking the 70s and 80s, right? So they would say, okay, I'm going to use the SSL, because SSL was pretty new in the 80s, right? I like the SSL EQ, but I like the Neve preamp. Well, let's build a channel strip just from the channel. So they would take the circuits from that, or they would build one, or you would have guys that would take the schematics of a channel, like an SSL channel, and build their own, because it's really, EQ is really consisted of resistors, capacitors. Basically, you're looking at basically a variable resistor which controls the voltage, volume, like a VCA, variable control amplifier. You're just controlling the volume level, and then based on the capacitor, depends on how much high end, how much mid, low end. Obviously, the bigger the capacitor, the more low end, the smaller capacitor, But we get into microfarads and get into electronics. But anyhow, they know this. They build an EQ, or they'll build one similar to something that came out of a console. And they might, because they built their own type, they come up with their own name, like a GML EQ, right? So they got their own name, and people love the way it sounds. And all of a sudden now they turn it into an actual EQ that you can buy, a 19-inch rack or even a 500 series rack, right? And it becomes really, really popular. It's like the Pultec EQs, which are well known because they got like 2,000 tubes in it or whatever. I'm exaggerating, but I'm being, So people really love the way EQ, Pultec EQs function, the way you can really, manipulate the high end and the low end, and basically by boosting and attenuating at the same time. So that became a popular thing. So the Pultec EQs are really popular. But then with all these different choices of EQs, preamps, and compressors, this is the reason why you see a studio full of rack gear. They're just options. That's all that really is. I say, okay, I really like the way this EQ, I'm gonna use this GML EQ on guitar, but I really don't like the way it sounds on vocals. I'm going to use this EQ on vocals. I kind of like the way it has a smoother sound on vocals for this EQ. It could be an oversteer or whatever, right? Or it could be a TubeTech EQ, whatever. So that's what engineers are doing, right? So they're making all these choices, but that's how they're getting the recordings, believe it or not. It's just deciding what microphone's going to sound on the artist, what's a good preamp, what's a good compressor, and what's a good, creating a chain. And that would have went to tape in that order, right? So it basically went like this. Everything's routed through the patch bay because it's just easier to plug into a patch bay than to always go to every single individual source behind and trying to climb behind and plug into that piece of gear. So it's just easy to have all the gear plugged into a patch bay, and I just plug in according to what I need from the patch bay, right? So that's what they do. And that would route to the console because I can monitor through the console, and then it would be direct outs or whatever coming, or bus outs coming from the console into the tape machine. Tape machine then will return back into the console if it's split. If it's a split console, because it doesn't have two sets of inputs, one side would, split. One side would be coming, for recording. The other side would come return from the tape machine for mixing. But if it's a inline console, then they would have where they could use, the channels playing double duty, right? So that's why you see some consoles with small faders and big faders. So one's playing double duty. One's monitored to the tape machine. The other one's monitoring from the tape machine to the tape machine, and then from the tape machine. So if I go to the tape machine, I'm just monitoring to hear what's going on. Coming from the tape machine, I've captured my recording. Now I'm ready to mix. That sort of deal, right? So they're making decisions. Okay, well, do I want to use the console's EQ or do I want to use an external EQ? It's the same thing. It's the same options. Well, as plugins came in, plugins just became a software version of whatever. It's a software version of emulation. That's why you'll see some plugins that look like vintage rack gear. They modeled it after a 1176 or an LA2A. It's just a model version of it. Plugins make it a lot more affordable for you to get an LA2A than buy an actual $8,000 LA2A compressor. Because most time, if you get an LA2A compressor, you can only afford one of them. Some studios can afford two. Or like if you're like, Ocean Way, where he has so many artists, he can afford 10 of them. Or you're like, or like you do like John McBride, who owns Blackbird, he has 25 of them. He's probably invested over $100 million, but Martina McBride was making a lot of money as a country. She had #1 hits, for him to do that. But to make a long story short, so that's the typical process. So anyhow, it's coming from the patch bay through the console to wrap to a tape machine. But now we're not using tape machines. We're just going to an interface. A lot of big interfaces, like they like to use like Antelopes or Market Unicorns, or they like to use RMEs, or they like to use maybe sort of Lynx Auroras, or maybe the some of the other interfaces out there that Apogee, or the Burls. So they're just interfaces, and that's just going to a hard drive. Some of these studios were using their own hard drive units, like for example, there was Radar System. That's the tape machine. And then but the routing is still the same. Instead of going to an actual physical 2-inch tape machine, it would go to the interface. And then you're recording into your whatever DAW. Most people like to use Pro Tools. It was marketed that way. But most people don't realize I can use any DAW, right? I can use Logic Pro. I can use, Studio One. I can use Harrison Mix Bus, whatever you choose, right? That's what people are doing now. So they're just, but that's the signal flow. So if you understand the signal flow, believe it or not, the the equipment doesn't know it's in the house. But if you know what you're doing, because some of these houses they have, especially in Berry Hill and Nashville, some of them are houses that's just been converted, into studios, especially in Berry Hill. Most of them are houses. They used to be houses. Um, so that's why I made this. That's why I made this channel and prove it over and time again. There's some people say you have to be in a commercial building. And I said no. You just got to know. You have to make people think you went to a commercial building if you're doing it in your home. That's the difference. Because the equipment itself, like those antelope, not the antelope, but those Avalons, doesn't know it's in this house. It doesn't care. The equipment itself doesn't care. As long as you know how to use equipment, you'll get the same results. That's the key. You got to know how to use equipment. So if you understand the signal flow and know what the equipment is going to do to the signal flow, you're 50% there. So, and Warhart said, I'm DAWless. And there are studios like that are still, believe it or not, there are studios that are still consoles, tape machines, and outboard gear. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, simply because that's how it was done. If I go back and listen to, if you go back and listen to 70s records, 80s records, DAWs didn't exist. And those recordings came out amazing. If I go back and listen to a Michael Jackson record, Thriller or whatever, that wasn't done in a DAW. It was done on a tape machine to a console. And Bruce Swedien used outboard gear, as along with the other assistant engineers, because it was more than just Bruce. Bruce was just the chief engineer, but there was other engineers. That's sometimes we don't know that. It's kind of like with Chris Lord-Alge. People don't know Chris Lord-Alge has assistants. You just see Chris Lord-Alge, but there is assistants. You just don't see the assistants. Same thing with Andrew Sheps and Sylvia Massey and all these other engineers, right? You see them, you just don't realize, yeah, they have assistants. The same thing with Joe Correll from Treasure Isle. He has assistants, right? So that's the way it was done. The DAW just made it. The key thing to me at DAW, and I knew this was I saw this in the 90s. I knew DAWs because DAWs it's not that DAWs are better than tape machines. DAWs are equal to tape machines. What makes DAWs is because of the editing capability. A DAW it's not restricted to like 24 tracks. You can have 40 tracks on a DAW, just a matter of how much your computer can process and how much RAM and how fast and everything is going, and how much storage. So and now that we have, computers and the technology, 5 terabyte hard drive or 10 terabyte, yeah, you got plenty of tracks. But 24 track was pretty much the standard for about, 25 years, 30 years, right? Maybe 40 years. If you had 24 tracks, you had enough tracks to record, do everything for 24 tracks. But most music was bands, right? But now that we got, creative with synthesizers and VSTs, I'm not limited to just drums, guitar, bass, and organ or Wurlitzer sound. I can use, keyboard synthesizers have thousands of sounds. So I can put 20 different sounds and 20 different tracks if I want to, and not even affect the track count, right? So, but your words, your editing is crucial. But you think about it, and as you said, your DAWs, but you got to remember a key thing. When someone has a DAW, you got the ability to use plugins, right? Oh, Spawn, she said salute. Salute. Oh, I got to do my military salute, the Army, we all salute like this, because I got glasses on, so it's military. Everyone knows I was Army. So if you think about it, it's all about, so some people are wondering, what does it take? What are they doing, right? And I've always said this. Let's say if you listen to, I'll just use a classic rock track, for example, right? Let's just use a rock track. I'll just use Back in Black, AC/DC, right? what is he doing to make that track sound like a track, right? Like it sounds for what we listen to on, YouTube or music videos or the radio, whatever, right? What does it sound like it sound? And typically, what the engineer would have done, and they'll probably use drum overdubs as well. He'll have like the kick right here. I gotta watch this fan because it is warm up here. He'll put kick on one, snare here, right on track two, toms 3 and 4, whatever, 5 and 6, whatever, crashes, whatever, overheads. Then he'll have room mics and probably a couple of proximity mics to give, maybe between 8, maybe even 10 or 10 channels on the drums, right? Because bass guitars are so, they carry so much energy. A low end, you really can run a mono track on a bass guitar, a single track. So that might be on channel 13, right? Just that bass. You really don't need to run that in stereo. Then they might have a pair of guitars, 14, 15, 16, whatever, right? And then he might, of course, on that, you got the vocals, maybe 17, and maybe he might have a second vocal with a little delay on it, on 18 or whatever. Then he'll have run maybe a pair of other vocals or whatever, other overdubs, 19, 20, 21, 22, whatever. And that's spread across 24 tracks. Then he'll take, you got your auxiliaries, right? That's where your reverb is at. And your ping pong delay and your other delays, your slap delay, maybe a spring delay or whatever on that. You might use a concert hall, so maybe 4 to 6 auxiliary tracks for reverbs on different channels. So those are blended in with the regular tracks, with the regular channels. Those are blended in. And then also some of those are all those drum tracks might be subbed into one sub drum group. So you get a good, nice mix with the drums, and that's going to subgroups 1 and 2 as a drum bus group. So I can add more. I might, instead of inserting certain compressors on each individual channel, I'm going to put just a bus group, like maybe like a API 2500 on the entire bus group for that, the control dynamics, because compressors are really designed to control volume peaks, right? So after that, everything might be busted, then those are going to bust to the main bus. And I'm going to make a decision and say, okay, what do I want on my main bus? Do I want some pull tags? Do I want Gmail EQs? Do I want to use do I want to use the channels, the bus compressor in like an SSL with the built-in bus compressor? I'm going to turn it on, and all the signals going through that bus compressor to the output. Or do I want to use an external bus compressor in a rack? They make those decisions. And then after they made the decision, they're listening to the speakers, say, okay, I love the way everything sounds coming through the speakers. Okay, that sounds good. So now your output of your console for your bus out, that's going to, a lot of times it's actually the output is also in the patch bay. And they'll plug in that and they'll go to a two track master. A lot of times it was just a half inch tape machine that was a 2-track half-inch, and they would print that, and then that master was sent to basically a mastering engineer. But now we can print that instead of doing it onto 2-inch tape or a half-inch tape. We just print it onto its own 2 separate stereo tracks in the DAW, and then that 2 stereo track can actually go to the mastering engineer, and then he'll master from there. That's the process. So the concept is pretty much the same whether no matter what genre you're doing. You're just trying to get your mixing console in your DAW. If you're going to use an actual DAW's mixer instead of an actual analog mixer, or even if you're going to use because believe it or not, there are people that actually have digital mixers. But you got to remember, digital mixers are still converting from analog to digital. So you're depending on your your digital's mixer, how good is the conversion compared to maybe using a a mark, a unicorn, and or antelope, or a Lynx or an RME, those type of interfaces. Is my converter in my, like, for example, my Personas Live, does it sound as good as those type of converters? That's kind of like a subjective question, but that's what you kind of got to think of um, in the recording process. So I hope this fan isn't messing with, because like I said, it's warm up here. About to get the AC unit fixed up here, but so just want to kind of throw that out, understanding the signal process. I got a few videos. You just got to go back into my archives of videos on, like, understanding patch bays or understanding signal flow. If you just don't understand how that works, my setup up here, even though it's in this bonus room and it's kind of cramped up in here, it's the signal flow is the same way you would see in a recording studio. It's the same way. So let me read some more comments. Okay, so Man Network said, yeah, have been too busy to tune in for. Yeah, me too. Plus, I've been having computer issues and so forth. But Ogilvy says, I was under the impression that you were about to start an art renaissance. Nah, not really. No, I'm not about to do that. So, oh, yes, a cassette tape player with a built-in mic, sort of. I got you what you're saying. So, so yeah, let me see this recent monthly dollars and see console and task. No, tape. Yeah, gotcha. And then let me see, got some more. There's super high-end converters. I don't know if it's worth the call. Well, like a super high-end converter would only be worth it if you want. It depends on what you want to do recording wise. Like if you're going to record people for a business, let's say you're going to open up your recording studio, you're going to record bands, I would definitely invest in a high-end converter, because you're going to want a multi-track. And a high-end converter with a pretty powerful PC or Mac makes life a lot easier than trying to do, because if you don't have the tools to do the recording, you're not going to get clients. Or you're going to, if you get out there and advertise that you can and you can't, then you're going to develop a bad reputation. So you got to be able to supply, like a band, you want to record a band. Well, the band depends on the band. You definitely want to make sure that the drum room is going to be captured properly. The drums, how you're going to mic the guitar, how you're going to do the bass, keys if they got it, and other guitars and overdubs and stuff like that. And can your PC or Mac handle the multi-tracking? Yes, believe it or not, you can start recording. It's easy to say I'm going to record 1 or 2 tracks at the same time. But now you're trying to record 24 tracks. Your PC or Mac is trying to capture that, and sometimes it can't handle it, and the PC or Mac will lock up. And now you're in trouble, because the recording, they can't stop for you to say, oh man, we got to come back another day because I got to invest in enough $3,000 computer so I can handle them all. They're gonna just pack their stuff and leave. They're not gonna. They like, because they're paying for this, right? So let's see. Deal said power supply used to cost about $150 under, depending on the wallet. I'm glad that was the only problem you saw. Yeah, it was just the power supply. Believe it or not, the power supply was only $40. Yeah, that was my issue, because I came up here one time and the computer was acting funny, and then I knew something was off because the power LED was flashing, but it wouldn't boot up. I'm like, oh yeah. So you're asking, is the 12,000 much better than the 50? It depends. That really is not about the cost. It's about, can it handle the job? Let's say you buy, like, for example, one of the best bangs for the buck as far as when it comes to interfaces, in my opinion, is like the Antelope, because it already comes with 32 inputs and outputs. You already have the inputs and outputs already in one unit versus buying three. For example, let's say you got the you were looking at, I would say maybe say the I'm gonna go with let's see, most of these interfaces, something like the Focusrite and also Universal Studio, Universal Audio, like their Apollo, right, or whatever. Some of those were only doing 8 channels, and then now you have to get 2 or 3 of them and sync them. With word clock, you got to sync them together. And a lot of times you have daisy chains the input output, but using 8AT light pipe, which is like fiber octaves. And you got it, and they're going to capture multi-tracking that way. Well, it doesn't matter as long as it works. And then, and then I see you're saying like something like the Prism, which is basically I think it's Lynx Prism, or it might be a Apogee Prism. I can't remember. I know about Radar. Radar is basically IZY or IZ Radar, which is its own independent hard disk recorder and converter and everything like that. You do all your editing through Radar, its own box. Then there's the Burrow, what they call it the Burrow mothership. That's the most expensive one. If you fully load like a 32 output, 24 input, or whatever the case, 24 out, depends on how you equip that Burrow. That might run you up to 25 or 30, 20 to 25, 30 grand building a high-end Burrow. But Burrow is supposed to be some of the best on the market. But once again, if I was not recording, if I wasn't doing something like orchestras like Air Studios does in London, right? Air Studios in London does high-end orchestra recordings and things like that. And they're getting paid. These orchestras might be for a movie theme, or maybe it's Paramount and they've hired this orchestra to record the score for a movie, and they're going to go there. Yeah, you better have something like a Burrow, because they probably ain't no telling between 30-piece orchestra or whatever, and you probably have 60 microphones. So ain't no telling how many preamps you're using for the console as well as outboard gear. Yeah, you better have an audio interface, because that's probably a $10 million movie they're making. So they probably wouldn't even hire you to come in and say, yeah, I got this little 2-channel M audio. They're going to get out of here. No. But if you tell them, yeah, I got a Burrow mothership, and I got 64 channels of input now, yeah, then yeah. And they're like, well, okay, yeah, you got the Burrow, you got a Neve VR88, 48-channel console, or, what kind of micro? Yeah, we got, 47s, 67s, 87s, we got 81s, and we got Sennheiser 421. And you start talking that type of gear, and they're like, oh yeah, who's your engineer? Oh yeah, we got whatever, who's a top engineer, has been doing it for 30 years. Yeah, your studio's gonna get hired, without a doubt. But yeah, that's the recording engine. I just want to talk about the process. So the object when you're working in your DAW is to think, how would a recording studio, I'm talking about a console with the console and outboard gear and the tape machine, how would they, that's how you're going to get a lot of the same results. Even if you're recording VST electronic music, it's still going to sound good if you're going through channels and buses and set up your auxiliaries and set up your master bus and stuff like that. It really is. It will make a difference. So that's all I really wanted to talk about tonight. And I know probably usually sometimes I would have some more people tuning in, but like I said, sometimes people are like, well, we don't know when you're coming on and all, because lately, I haven't been coming on every Sunday, and I just don't get the opportunity to do it. Yes, so they're going to discriminate against Scarlett. No, I'm not discriminating against Scarlett. I have no problem with Focusrite Scarletts. But I'm just talking about, it really depends on, as far as interfaces. I'm really talking about choices. Depends on. Um, Believe it or not, I got all this gear, but it's really designed for my personal use. So it's kind of like overkill, like ridiculously overkill. But I have a lot of options. I like options. Um, so, but my studio, if I wanted to, can equip to record a band because I bought the gear to do it. You know, but some people are that's not their goal when they're building their studio. Some people say, I want to be able to I want to build my studio, and I want to. I'm only building my studio because I want to do my own personal music. I'm not trying to record no one else. So then you have to look at a 2-channel focused 2i2 would be perfect for that, or an M Audio, you know, or even Apollo Twin, maybe even a Behringer, the little Euphoria 2-channel. It would be perfect because you're only recording 2 channels, and then a lot of times you're going to use the outputs as your 2-channel, your 2-channel master output. All I need to use what's happening out the left and right. So our little small interface is perfect because I'm going to use VST instruments. I'm going to record 1 or 2 instruments at a time. I'm going to use plugins. I'm just going to record out of the DAW and so forth. But a lot of times some people say, well, then if I'm going to just do that, then why do I need a mixer? Well, I would say this. With the 2-channel mixer, or just going to a mixer, especially an analog mixer, and you have everything spread over the channels, everything's going to sound bigger. That's just the way it is. A lot of people may not believe that, but yeah, that's true. So Matthew says, I used a Burl B2 bomber on my last track. Those things sounded, like I said, Burl. Now we're talking big boys. I would even say going to a Burl is like jumping from, let's say you're used to driving a Pontiac Firebird, and I would say like a Firehawk, right? 305 horsepower car, 6-speed. It's got an LS motor in it. The torque is insane on that, right? They're fast, right? And then you jump into, I would say, let's say you jump onto a Corvette ZR1, the C8 ZR1, which goes from 0 to 60 in like 2.7 seconds. The takeoff speed, jumping from a 5-second car to a 2.5-second car, is insane the way it feels. My Corvette, and I just have a C5. It's a C5 convertible. And it's a 4-second car, right? It's like 0 to 60 in like 3.9, almost 4 seconds, right? Because it's a light car. When I jumped into a C8, the acceleration was ridiculous. And my C5 is no joke. It will kill most, it's brutally fast, but not like the C8, not those ZR1s. Those are that's bike fast. This Corvette you're talking acceleration as fast as bikes. I'm talking if you're a bike rider, like a Honda, like a, CBR 1000 or, Yamaha R1000, like a Gixxer GSX, 1000, bikes like that. That's like jumping from low end interface to like a Burl. Now, so that's my take on it when it comes to gear. It says, I'm trying to wean myself off of buying plugins, VST dials, etc. Upgrade to a complete 15, but that's it. Okay, yeah, complete, which is a great VST instrument plugin, which is they're great. I like VST. I have I have the IK multimedia with the sample tank, and of course I use the chord complete, the chord collection, as well as other VST instruments, synth anthology. Love that setup, which is great. So automatically, like flying first class
You
want to supermodel, but don't get you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good analogy. Okay. Um, so Vigilante says, any tips to getting better at mixing? I would say this. If you're not used to doing this, I would say this. Uh, create you a template where you know that you can start with, let's say, a template, and you can save this template. And of course, you can always rename the track. It's not going to overwrite. It's just going to create a new. When you start using that template, it's going to, and you rename it and save it as another name. It's just going to create a whole new different track, but your template will still be there. I would say like create 24 tracks, maybe create 8 buses with maybe 6 auxiliary channels, and use that as your template every single time. And the reason why I would say that, because the buses and the auxiliaries are always going to be your places where you're going to use your channels to bus into, and you're always using your auxiliaries for your reverbs, your processing like that, your delays and stuff like that on those auxiliaries. You may change up your reverbs from time to time, but that would definitely help. As well as, what else can you say about getting mixing? Well, get used to, you got to ask yourself, now, what was the number one, what was some of the ubiquitous gear people were using, right? Like distressors, right? If you got a plug-in like a distressor, or another thing at mixing is understand how the real gear works. And if you understand how the real gear works, like how a compressor works, how the EQ works, the plug-in is going to work the exact same way. Most people have a problem with plug-ins simply because they don't know how to use the real gear either. I've seen people like, well, I'm going to use 5-to-1 compression on a kick, and sometimes the kick doesn't need 5-to-1 compression, a ratio on that. Sometimes it only needs 4-to-1. Or it might need 8-to-1. It depends how much you're squashing or compressing. Compressing or squashing is the same term, right? And then on top of that, sometimes even though you might have 5-to-1 ratio of compression, sometimes you don't need to attack it using a fast attack so fast. Sometimes you need to slow down the attack. That's mean attack is how fast, how aggressive the compressor is going to work on the signal. Sometimes I need to slow it down so it doesn't sound like it's automatically. Think of attack like a greedy person. You ever seen? Think of it like a dog. You give your dog a brand new puppy. The minute you pay for it, you can't keep the food in the dog tray fast enough. He's, that's not fast attack, right? As an older dog, 10 years old, you lay his food, he looks at it for a minute, kind of stares at you, kind of stares back at the bowl, kind of hard, crunchy dog food again, huh? Okay. Yeah. I'm getting no steak like you're eating up there on the table. Yeah. It's hard food, just messing up my teeth. I don't eat it. That's a slow attack, right? And then the taste of the food is like the release, right? So you got to think of compressors like that, right? How aggressive do I want to be? And then of course there's the makeup volume, right? Now the threshold is just when do I want the attack? When do I want the compressor to work? That's all the threshold's for. So I'm at -30. So when my signal hits -30, that's when the compressor can work. Or do I want -40? Right? That's what I want. That's all you got to think. It's kind of like that person holding a Rottweiler, and he's sitting holding with the chain, and like, or a well-trained German Shepherd, sit, don't move. And the German Shepherd is sitting there, but he's waiting. Then you say, go. Then the German Shepherd, that's threshold, right? So anyhow, so you understand compressors. Then you understand EQ. I did a video on this on EQ before, right? A lot of times if you see EQ, like let's say we buy a plug-in like a Fab Filter, or let's say we get a free one like the Nova, right? The Nova plug-in. You'll see every time you see that, you always see the box, right? And every time you'll see a lot of times at the bottom, you'll see like, or maybe at the top, it may say 20, 40, 60, 100, 250, 500, 800,000, 15, 1500, 2000, 14, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12, 16, and then 20K. These are the frequency ranges that you'll common, right? Those are very common. And then you'll see the line in the middle. Then you'll see positive numbers, positive 3, positive 6, positive 9, 12, 15, which is dB volume levels, right? And below that line, you'll see negative 3, negative 6, negative 9, and so forth, right? Well, think of your EQ. Even if you're on a console, the 12 o'clock position on the EQ is that line that you see in your plugin, right? That's that line. You'll see. So now you got to think about each of those frequencies. If I got a high, mid-low, and then low, how much of that frequency do I want to hear, or do I want to boost, or how much do I want to cut? Anything below the line, you're attenuating. Anything above the line, you're boosting, right? So you got to think of EQ like that. And then, another thing that people can mess up on is on reverb, because they can have the decay of the reverb too long, like a reverb tail, right? That's like when you hear this. A lot of times that can start to sound muddy. So a lot of times you bring a slow, faster decay, so it cuts off faster. But you still want to get an ambient room sound, right? Right. So you're trying to do that. So you got to understand EQ, then you got to understand delay. But if you understand preamps, compressors, what they do, EQs, how they work, reverbs and delays, you are another 50% there. So, let's see. Dio said, are there higher levels of plugins? What are like the Chevy, Porsche, and Rolls Royce of plugins? Once again, there are some people love the universal audio plugins, right? Some people like someone, don't just doing fat filters. Some people love, there are some people that are really adamant using Slate. And then there are some people that really are adamant about, for example, I would say like Solvetube or Soundtoys. Then there is Plugin Alliance. And somebody just, Osito. It really depends. Like me, I use Slate from time to time. I use some Waves. A lot of the plugins I'm using is the IK Multimedia, because I have their Studio Pro. But I've always been using the T-Rax plugins, and I have no problems with their plugins. But I also, I'm a big advocate of Acoustica Audio plugins. Those plugins are amazing, but they are processor heavy. They do use a lot of processing. They really, I would say this: if your PC or Mac is not powerful enough, it doesn't really not going to matter which plugin, because the processor can't handle, because that processor is trying to do a lot of work. It's trying to handle the video. It's trying to handle your sound card. It's trying to run other programs like the actual operating system and other programs that needs to run, as well as it's trying to process audio, and it's trying to process, the plugins that you got, in your DAW. It's trying to do a lot of work. And if you don't have a, very powerful PC or Mac, you will notice it real quick. Even if you try to change, sometimes you go back and change the setting. Like I'm going to run, instead of running 256, I'm going to up my bus, my bus processing or my sample rate and so forth. I'm going to jump it up to 10, 50, whatever it is, right? Or maybe 20, whatever it is, instead of running at 256 or whatever, or 128. A lot of times people slow that down for recording, then they'll forget to, you up it for the playback. Because what slows it down is the playback doesn't slow the computer down like it does trying to process data coming in. And let's see, got another question. How How much difference would it make if you bring your VST or synth keys through a vintage sampler? Would that be worth the money? Well, once again, it's really if you build like the ultimate Mac or the ultimate gaming or powerful PC, then it wouldn't make a ton of difference because your computer can handle it. And then I say Mac digital signal processing hard drive. It really, like I said, because there's some people that have PCs. So it really depends. I see some people are agreeing on Fab. Like a lot of people like Fab, especially their EQ, the Fab filter EQ and all that. But like I said, I'm an IQ Multimedia T-Rex guy, as well as acoustic audio. But I also have I have Waves. I use Slate. So it really depends. So it really, really depends. Oh yeah, the latency. Yeah, I'm sure people know what latency means. That's from the time you do something to the time you actually hear the result. The delay effect. You start hearing this, after you hear tack, duke, that's latency. But what else on that? So I hope that answers some of the mixing or that Vigilante was asking about, or as far as mixing. Just really understand what gear does and understand signal flow, and understand another question or another understanding would be time and experience will let you know choices. That's really going to be a choice thing. Should I use this compressor? Should I use that microphone? Should I use that EQ? Should I use that reverb? That's really choice. Yeah, a lot of times when you really learn how that compressor sounds, you'll know when I like that compressor, but I don't really like the way, like my Alesis 3630s. I know when I'm going to use those and when I'm not going to use them. Your ear get used to hearing how 3630 sound. It's like, well, that because those can be really, really aggressive sounding compressors, and when they're overly aggressive sounding, they can actually make the stuff sound cheap. That's why a lot of people don't like Alesis 3630s, because they're a compressor that you can overuse it. So Adolf Twitler, that's funny. Adolf Twitler, that's funny. Let's see, plugins are in the source of the vast majority of latency. You can get around it by bouncing to a stereo track to play along with to keep the machine focused on the track. Yeah, like I said, it's all about the processing. So it's all about how powerful your PC or Mac is. So it really depends. So what else? What else to talk about on the recording process? So, yeah. So in the end, and there are people that are going to use a mixture of outside source instruments like keyboards, guitars, along with VST instruments. I do that all the time. Like I definitely use VST instruments like my drums. I program my drums. Some people record the drum, but I program my drums, because in the end, the consumer doesn't know or care. If they sound like drums to the consumer, meaning the listener, the audience, the people that buy the music or listen to the music, they don't care if they sound like real drums or sequence drums. They don't care as long as the beats sound good. Sometimes I'll play real bass. Sometimes I'll play a bass guitar sound, either VST instruments or from a keyboard. Sometimes I'll use key sounds from a VST instrument. Sometimes I use and record audio keys. And the same thing with guitar, but definitely if I'm going to record vocals, there's going to be real vocals. So I'm definitely going through a real microphone and preamp. And that's pretty much it. So other than that, yeah, I didn't get a lot of questions tonight, or I didn't get a ton of comments tonight, which Sometimes it's like that. Um, I really do like doing these live streams though. When I do get a chance to do them, I really do like to do doing the live streams. So I'll probably be on here for a few more minutes, and I'm going to shut it down. So other than that, I just want to see what people thoughts. I don't know if people were tuned in. Maybe people tuned in later when I was talking about the music industry, or what you think about the recording. Well, I do want to say this though. I do want to get people's thoughts on, because we already know the recording industry is affected by the music industry, right? So, what are your thoughts? Because there are recording studios that have started closing down because artists don't get advances anymore to pay for the studio time. Now, record labels want artists to be established, meaning some artists need to already have their own recording studio and recording. In other words, some of these artists probably need to have a million streams on YouTube and all that before they even get looked at. So, Opus, thank you for your streams. I really do learn a lot. I appreciate it. Thanks. Um, you'll say, let's see, Deal, you asked, what does it take to make a better beats, in your opinion? Drums make a big difference, but how much do you consistently make bangers? How do you turn the corner reach that level? Believe it or not, this is a trick, and I've learned this from Teddy Riley. What Teddy Riley does. Teddy Riley basically will layer drums. Teddy Riley can have as much as 5 snares going at the same time to get one solid sounding snare. So let's say he got this, right? But he wants to get this popping sound, right? He'll layer 2 or 3 snares. One snare, let's say it sound like a thin sounding, let's say it could be a Black Beauty snare, right? Which is a popular drum snare, right? God. Then you have another snare that might have a little pop. You add those two together, get this pop. That's how he's getting it. Then the same thing with the kick. He's layering the kick. He might have a regular bass drum kick along with a synth kick. So the kick might be like do 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 do, right? Then he might have a little kick on another track on. So now you get this to distinguish that kick, and then you had a next you got. That's what he's doing. So that is one way to get them to make them sound like bangers. Whenever you can get something that you can get, if you get that, people that like to dance they can be like, oh man, yeah. It's the same thing. You think about it when what really drives in hip hop, a lot of 808, 909s and 808. Right, that really low end. It's the same concept, that will drive people. It's the same thing in rock. You don't have to have such low end, such really dominating low end in rock, but the kick needs to thump. That's why they like API gear on rock music, because it got this push to the signal. Like you have a got this right for the kick, right? And that's the reason why some drummers like they record. A lot of times they have maybe like a was a D112 or D12 in the kick, and they might have maybe one next to the beater, which is the skins inside, another one outside. Then they also might have a FET 40, a FET 47 also capturing the kick drum. To really get that really driving kick drum sound, whatever the genre, that's what they're doing. And then, but they're also gonna, let's say because drums are really really aggressive, I need to put some fast compression on it. So I might throw 2 or 3 1176s on the kick, a couple of 1176s on the snare. But I don't want the bass guitar to be as aggressive, because I need to hear the distinctive of the bass, especially the bass player picking versus fingering versus slapping, right? So it depends on that compressor as well. So if that makes sense. I hope that answers your question, DL, on that about the beats. Um, Try, especially try to layer. If you just want to use drum, layer it. The 2 or 3 drum layers. Believe it or not, you'll be amazed how much more impact if you layer. Um, Matthew said it's all related. No CD money, less recording budget, home recording on a. Yeah, I mean, the music industry. A lot of times when people say the music industry did because people don't buy CDs and all that, but you got to remember who benefited from it the most. Record labels. Artists never really benefited from it anyway. Artists didn't own their masters. They didn't get the bulk of the sales. Artists got small crumbs. That's why they would get maybe a 1, 2, 3 point off the sales. For the so they made they sold platinum. Now they would get the accolades from it, but they just wouldn't get the revenue. And what I mean by the accolades is they can, if they went platinum, they'll get platinum, and they might be recommended because it went platinum. They got so popular, they're getting radio play. They'll get, maybe they'll get a voting board for them to be announced at the Grammys or the American Music Awards or whatever. So they'll get that accolade, especially if they win. If they win that award, they'll get the award. They'll get a Grammy. They'll get they'll get the. I'm gonna use my fake Grammy here. I got a fake Grammy because that was always my goal, to have a Grammy. Of course, I don't have a real Grammy, so I gotta have a fake Grammy. So I'm like, thank you. I just want to thank all my fans out there. And let me stop. So yeah, you can get one of them, but even if you got a real Grammy, it ain't worth nothing. Well, it might be worth something when you die, especially if you want to, but and of course you get the RIA awards. Those are the gold and platinum albums on the award, but those you can't. That's not where your money's coming from. So it really depends. All right. He said, well, YT compression is evil. Don't trigger it. I'm laughing, but anyhow. So, and 24-bit DVD, versus, the Common was 16-bit, like, it's not like your records are going to sound brutally bad if you're, using, 16-bit 44.1 sample rate. That's the Common CD one. Heavy digital stuff, definitely probably, 24-bit, and you're doing 48 or even 96 sample rate, 96K sample rate. But for common recording, especially analog recording, you'll be perfectly fine with 16-bit 44.1. This virtual synths can have interesting sounds and tones, but still sounds and feel weak to me. How do you beef them up and make them stand out like songs from 80s? Same thing, you layer. Believe it or not, layering. If you have an EP sound, electric piano sound, it can be an FM synthesis type of sound that Yamaha was so known for, the FM synthesis sound. You pick an FM synthesis type EP sound. Babyface overabused that, but he got some Grammys. But anyhow, the FM, that DX7 FM sound, right? So, with that, but if you listen to if you listen to a Yamaha DX7 today, and then you listen to like my Motif, I got the Motif XF, or even a Montage, and listen to the same type of electric piano sound, FM synthesis type EP sound, it's going to sound a ton better because DX7s only were 8-bit processing, because computers just didn't have the processing power in the 80s. So he doing it with analog filters. Yeah, it's kind of like now it's like they're using envelope processing filters, like they were using LFOs, which stands for frequency oscillating, low frequency oscillating, or they were using HPFs, high pass filtering, and they were using envelope, and they were manipulate analogs along with the 8-bit processing to come up with the sound. But now, like my Chronis, my Motif, my Roland Phantom, with the, you're talking 64 to 128 bit sampling and modeling, they're just going to sound richer. So you can take a VST, if it's a DX7 sample piano sound, and then you take one from like my Roland Phantom, the new Roland Phantom, right? That same type of EP sound, the new Roland Phantom is going to sound a ton better. That's why I'm not into when it comes to trying to sound rich and full, and that's why I'm not into a lot of those 80s boards, because they just, they were a niche thing because that's all we had then in the 80s. DX7s, DX21s, DX5s, the Poly 8000 Korg or the Korg M1, those older boards. But now computers can, the processing power of the computer, and since the day, even not the classic, but I'm talking about even the VST instruments today are tons sound better. So that's how you can get them to sound better if you're using sounds. And a lot of times those sounds can sound like layered. This is the reason why sometimes you'll have some sounds like, keyboards today, you can layer up to 16 layers of sounds. That's why you have someone with an EP with a string patch layered together to create this fuller sound. Try that. You'll be amazed. A lot of times when you start listening to the songs from the 80s, and of course you got to remember, a lot of those sounds are also going through processing. Like they're going through compressors, and they were going through preamps and stuff like that to beef up the sound too. So you got to kind of look at that too, why they sound like they sound on some of these records. Like if you think about Thriller, which mostly a lot of those Thriller sounds were some of those analog synth sounds that you don't have. I'm talking about the one that have like maybe a Moog or something like that, where you have to plug in the cables and you have to adjust the filtering on it, some oscillators, LFOs and stuff like that. And you're making adjustments to create one sound, and you're layering, that on top of Jupiter and Jupiter, Roland Jupiters, and you were using like the Linn drum machines, like that's a Linn drum, right? And on top of that, they also still recorded a real drummer. The drummer he's playing real drums that he layered. They mixed in that Linn drum with a real drummer, just like they layered in a real bass guitar with an actual synth bass. They were layering. They layered heavy back then. That's also, so let me see. I said quality. Yeah, definitely. So, but I already talked about preamps. Let me see. Oh, Ward said, why does my fake tofu veggie burger not taste like a real burger? Well, maybe because it's not cow, it's not actual beef. So, but I get what you're saying. Do virtual preamps work? No. I'm just gonna be honest. No. Two key factors: whether it's a preamp that's a solid preamp, or it's a preamp with tubes. One of the key factors to making that preamp sound like it sounds is input and output transformers. No Mac or PC has input or output transformers. Macs or PCs do not need PC, transform input and output transformers, because that's not the job. The up step voltage and down step voltage, transforming it. The PC and Mac is designed for one thing: visual and audio processing when it comes to like software programs. That's their key component. So that's why. But the sound source, along with op amps, high-end op amps, capacitors, the resistors, the preamp, the tube circuit or solid state circuit, that's the key. You're not going to get that because you don't have it. you can try to get software to model like a preamp. And a lot of times you can get the illusion because sometimes you can run a preamp plug-in, turn a volume up, and it gets louder. But all you're really doing to the preamp plug-in when you turn the volume up is you're just turning up the sound card volume. And that's the illusion that because you turned up the volume in the preamp and it sounded louder in the system, that's the preamp working. When really all you did was to do the same thing where you turned up the volume in the preamp in the software, or you physically turned up the volume on your sound card. They're going to sound identical because digital is ones and zeros. It's binary. Digital doesn't make any sound. So when you're listening to stuff that's been converted, when you hear it coming back, you're hearing the conversion of digital ones and zeros converted back to analog for we can hear it. So we can understand it. Like right now that I'm talking to this microphone going into the computer, when all the computer hears is ones and zeros. But we don't understand. That don't make any sense to hear ones and zeros. And I'm being, funny with the way, but that's ones and zeros. So the converter's got to convert that back into, so y'all hear my voice to where y'all listening through on YouTube. So y'all converters are converting it back to, and a lot of, sometimes we think of A to D to DA converter, we think, interfaces, but the sound card in your computer, PC or Mac, is a converter. The sound card that's built into your CD player is an AD to DA converter. The sound card is in your synthesizer, your Roland Phantom or your Yamaha Montage is an AD to DA converter. The sound card in your digital mixer, like your Behringer X32 or your Midas, is an AD to DA converter. That's what you're hearing. You're hearing the conversion and how powerful the processing is to hear that conversion to make it sound like analog. That's what makes it sound, because you're always going to hear this tone. You're going to always hear this thing about, when you hear even order odd harmonics and all that, these harmonics and the distorted harmonics and all these, these saturation and all this stuff, you can only get that from analog, because that's how analog, the waves are being produced. Analog, like your voice, when you talk, you're creating a wave, an actual wave when you talk. And that wave has energy, right? That's, frequency waving energy, right? Well, digital doesn't do that. Digital is just ones and zeros. So the converter, that's why really the real fight between analog and digital and plugging all that is not really analog versus digital. It's really analog versus analog conversion. That's what that's where you always think, analog versus digital, analog versus digital, which sounds better. No, it's basically about, that's why you can take the same source, analog source, I don't care if it's trumpet, run it through a cheap converter, and then you run it through an expensive converter. Well, an expensive converter, because an expensive converter can convert, it has the process. The only way, a best way to describe it is, I don't care what you do, because I'm into photography. I have cameras with lenses. You take your camera and, with your cameras, I don't care if you got an iPhone or Android or whatever. And, we got all these options of different cameras and all that. And of course, when you look at it, you're looking at, because the sensor is probably, in this camera, is probably a little bit smaller than the nail of my pinky, right? The sensor is small, trying to capture all this detailed information. Versus if I take a 35 millimeter sensor, that much, with a big size lens to capture so much lighting and detail. That's why a professional photo looks so much better, especially when you zoom in. You'll really see that photo break down as you zoom in. It'll really start to break down. A lot of people say, I took a picture with my phone. Look, zoom in. Or when you blow something up bigger than an average 8 by 11. Blow it up to you'll start seeing the quality break down real fast, because the lenses are too small and the sensor's too small. But real photographers know this. This is the reason why they still use high-end cameras in film and photography, because they know this. But the sampling rate and your ADDD converter also, it's like the more detail I can sample from a source, like whether it's playing someone's playing a guitar, or bass or vocals or whatever you're sampling, the more details of the quality of the tone I can sample, the better it's going to sound. But your processing has to be able to handle it. Low end, that's really what separates a cheap interface from an expensive one, is its ability to convert, as well as your computer's process to be able to process. This is the reason why, for example, go back to photography, you have a camera that can do 14 frames a second. It's because the buffer speed can't handle, it's trying to handle 14 frames that just came in a second. And it's trying to make high quality photos with 14 frames in 1 second. That's why they can only limit to how fast it can capture pictures. And that's pretty darn fast for 1 second, 14 frames of high quality photos in 1 second. Versus a cheaper lower end camera can't do that. That's why the cheaper lower end cameras maybe only 5 frames a second. So this is the reason why digital film, when we like 30 frames or 24 frames or 30 frames a second, FPS, frames per second. That's why that matters in digital quality. You have a camera that can handle the processing of high quality photos. This is the reason why, like Arri Alexa cameras are $100,000 as an example, because it's trying to capture, tons of detail in microseconds and still process it to the card that's going to your SD card or whatever it's going to. You got to have a serious powerful camera to do that. Same thing when it comes to your converting your music into your source. You want to have a high quality converter to capture detail. A low end converter will still capture the sound, but it won't sound as sonically like a higher end one. And I noticed tremendously when I went from the lower cost ones, like I had a Persona 1818 VSL for a while. And I noticed that when I switched to the Antelope, I would start using the Antelope Orion. Tremendous difference in the music that I was recording. So that makes sense. So let me see. I got a few more people doing. So let me see. Got a few more. These are it's fundamentally different. Exactly, because this you're really just the conversion, like I was saying earlier. Let me see. So they copy logarithmic harmonics for like I said, you got to remember that's why they have saturation, like we talked before with saturate. They're trying to create plugins that emulating. Plugins are emulations. It's a copy. It's emulating. It's not a real thing. Y'all remember the movie The Thing? And if you ever know the movie The Thing, it wasn't a real human. And then when it get exposed, it went crazy and that's plugins. They're just emulations. They're not real. But the object is the object with plugins and stuff like that is the purpose of that. The emulation is just good enough to fool. The average person can't really hear distinctive differences between plugins and the real analog gear, but a pro can, if that makes sense. Let's see. Oh, yeah, it's so true. Yeah. Let me see. Okay, let's just go on. Let's see. They say Terry Disper said, "What year was the first Rolling Stones record release?" You won't get it right. I know the Rolling Stones started in the 60s. It might be in the 50s. So I'm, like you're probably right. I probably won't get it, but I guarantee it's way earlier than most people. Just like people think Earth, Wind & Fire started in the 70s. When Earth, Wind & Fire actually, they were making records in the 60s. The same thing. James Brown actually started recording in the 50s. But you might have to throw the answer out there. I would guess 61, 62. I'm just gonna throw that out there. So let me see what I said. If you were making modern music analog, hardware matters less. You're recording drums, bass, guitar, vocals, analog sounds. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah. Like I said, it's really. Yeah, remember at the time when we go to to drums, bass, guitar, and that type of music, most of the music that we listened to was bands. You know, that's really that was the root of a band. Well, music was a band. That's why you would have Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and Earth, Wind and Fire and all the because the average band to make music, it was a drum set, bass, a couple of guitars maybe, and a keyboard player back there playing he's playing a Fender Rhodes, maybe an organ, maybe a Wurlitzer, and he might have a Moog or an Oberheim or ARP 2600 or something like that, or Prophecy, or those style of keyboards. That was the sound, but it was still fundamental. Then they would add in horn sections and percussion section, and on that was just lead and background vocals. That was probably 80%, of music for all genres across, whether it's country, rock. It was a band. As synthesizers becoming more and more popular in the 80s, and especially the 90s, and you start having musician producers like Teddy Riley and artists like that, where they started using more drum machines and just started using more synthesizer sounds to fill up the record. They got to the point where I don't need to have guitar, the guitar player, and he's got all these different effect pedals. He's pushing all these different effect pedals on the and trying to get a chorus or a flange sound from his guitar, or whatever case, or he's trying to change the settings or whatever, or he's trying to change which pickup he's going to use. I'm going to use the pickup close to the bridge, or whatever, close to the neck, or whatever, trying to get the different sound of the guitar. Because I got the synthesizer that can make pad sounds, synth sounds, lead sounds, sine wave sounds, sawtooth. It can make all these sounds that I don't need a guitar, so that's how music started changing in the 80s, especially with European music and all that. So I'm trying to read through some of these comments. Seven Sons, so will a 32-bit interface sound better than a 24-bit? Well, once again, it really depends, because 32-bit, versus 24-bit. It's possible, especially in digital, will it make a huge difference? In analog, probably not, because we're talking about 24-bit, 32-bit versus we're talking about sample rate. Like, will 192K sample rate sound better than 96K sample rate? It really depends. It depends on a lot of factors, really. Let me see. Hey, what's going on, CC Funk? So let me see. In Star Trek, they all ate all replica food, emulations of food from the computer. Yeah, in Star Trek, and Star Trek they're really filming on a movie set, but you think about if there was crews of people in space for real. I mean, because you think about it, part of why food grows is through photosynthesis and all that. We're talking the electromagnetic spectrum, or we talk about the sun, because plants can't live without the sun. So it's like if they're in a ship, how are they producing food? I always wonder how they always had enough fuel, to be able to continue to travel in space for years. Where are they getting the fuel from? Because you think about when they launch a real rocket into space, like the shuttle, as an example, the rocket pods, you got the fuel from the shuttle itself. Then there's also two external rockets. By the time they get to, how we got the atmosphere, the stratosphere, the biosphere, and all these different layers of the sphere, the levels of, as you get closer to, the name changes as you get closer to the thinner to the once you get out the ozone layer of the Earth or whatever. They've already expended all the fuel, so most of those big old fuel pods drop off. Then they got one left thing of fuel to continue to get up into, like, maybe they head into the International Space Station or whatever. But they run out of fuel really quick. And those things, if you ever went to one of those rocket pods with fuel, they're huge. I mean, those things are like 14-story buildings. That's how tall. They're huge. And they burn through all that fuel. So how are you traveling in space? Like how Star Trek, how do they do that? Burn fuel like that, But I know that's just a hypothetical, because I know Star Trek, not a real spaceship. But anyhow, Curse of the H, I think they released their record in 1960. Yeah, like I said, the Rolling Stones, when we think of the Rolling Stones, because, Rolling Stones, they had songs and they had a following, but, like you go back to the Rolling Stones, like, you start me up, and I never, that song, right? Um, um, and they had songs like that, but the Rolling Stones really biggest hits probably came in the 70s. But they were when you was an artist and you got signed at that time, when you were on a label, when you recorded songs and they didn't do so well, they just didn't drop you like they'll drop you today because it's so corporatized, right? They'll drop you now. If you can't make a hit for them like instantaneously, like a hit, they'll drop. They'll shelve or drop the artist. But 70s, 60s, artists can keep making records until they can get a hit, because the record labels would have faith in their artists. They're like, I know you can do it. Okay, that one ain't so good, but go back, go back to the studio and come up with something else. And so the artists would do that. You can't do that now unless you can if you're your own independent artist, because then you ain't under contract. So you're not under timeline. You're not under there's no timeline. That's another thing that people don't understand. When you're an artist, you got a timeline. I need to have a song and I got to make it. I got a release date. If I don't meet my deadline, I can be shelved to drop. I would never want to be under that kind of pressure. So, so everyone said junk sounds the same because people use the same fuel. So, well, I'm not a sampler like that, so I don't know. I can't comment on it. I just read your comment. So, the original Enterprise was all in all. Well, like I said, most of that was filmed on a film set in Los Angeles. So, yeah, they got part. When you're filming on a film set, you got plenty of fuel, So, Matthew said, I clipped her to vote, no problem. So, there are millions of samples. Who is saying they're also? I don't know. Well, like I said, I don't know. I'm not really big in sampling, so I don't know, but I still make music the old school way. I actually physically record my parts. So that's just me. But anyhow, it's been over 2 hours, and I'm about to wrap it up, call it a day. And like I said, if I don't have any issues, having any issues, I'll try to be back next week. Once again, hopefully be back in color instead of black and white. This is hilarious. This look like I'm filming in the 1950s, but it's all good, So I might throw on some throw some class. I don't know. So anyhow, I want to thank everyone. Thanks for always stopping by, and love the dedication and commitment. And I want to thank everyone. And I hope everyone have a good night. It is now 10 o'clock here. And y'all enjoy and keep making music, because we love good music. And y'all have a good one.